I mean that one human universal is the construction of societies to both mandate and reward monogamy. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. It's because it's the best long-term solution, fundamentally. But one of the reasons for that is that when women are scarce, men get violent. Now, that was read to say, well, I thought that this society should be distributing women to undeserving men, which is, of course, absolutely and utterly preposterous and bears no relationship whatsoever to anything I ever said or thought, or anything anyone sane would ever think or say, or has ever thought or said. Because I don't know anyone politically ever who was insane enough to think that the state should distribute women to men. Like, that's just never happened. So to be accused of that belief, and then for that to, be put forward as a credible representation of what I thought was just one of the preposterous things that has happened to me. There's a moral disapproval applied to, say, cheating, right? To adultery, to especially running around behind your partner's back if you're married, particularly that. But even if you're in a long-term stable relationship, it's like, well, that's all enforcement. It's not police with jackboots, but that's not the only type of enforcement. It's not the only type of sanction or threat or punishment or disappropriation or disgust or contempt or shame or frustration or disappointment, all of those things. And all of that because monogamy is a good long-term solution, but in some sense a troublesome short-term solution. If you have other options, then all of those elements of social support, let's say, need to be put into place. And that is it, as far as I've been able to determine by looking at the anthropological literature. Norms surrounding monogamy are a human universal. There are exceptions, but there are very specific situational reasons for those exceptions. What our society does to 19-year-old women, or 18-year-old women, 19-year-old women, we just lie to them all the time. The first lie is, there's nothing more important than your career, more or less by definition. So that's the first lie. The second lie is, there will be nothing more important to you in your life than your career. So that's the second lie. And then the third lie is, there should be nothing more important in your life than your career. So that's the third lie. And then implicit in that is the idea that children are a burden, and that the idea that women should have children is part of the oppressive patriarchy and should be resisted. And who are men to tell me what I can do with my body? And hey, fair enough, and et cetera, right till they reach partnership. But that's sort of an apogee, right? You hit partnership in a senior law firm, it's like you're at the top of your profession. Well, then what? Well, so then they looked around and they thought, here I am with all these like hyper-competitive men, perfectly willing to work 80 hours a week nonstop to stay at the top. What the hell are they doing? Because that's the real question. What is it that characterizes this small percentage of hyper-competitive men? It's not. You can assume that that's how everyone should be, but first of all, that isn't how everyone is. Or you can flip that and say, well, there's only a small minority of human beings that are willing to do this, to work flat out 8 hours a week. I mean, they're certainly being paid for it. Let's make no mistake about that. But well, what about the rest of life? Well, that's what the women asked. Why am I doing this? And that's a great question. Well, for men, there's a different answer than for women. It's a really different answer. And it isn't like the men are exactly thinking this through. It's more like this is an integral part of male motivation. The more successful you are as a man, the more women like you. You have a job or a career, and hopefully you're productive and you contribute something to the community, and you provide yourself and your family with the necessities of life. That's a quarter of your life, or a third of it, something like that. You have an intimate relationship, you have a family. That's life. And if you don't have one of those, that's 1/3 of your life you don't have. Now, some people, maybe they're doing so well on the other two fronts that they can cope with not having that. Or maybe they're doing so well on one front, they can cope with not having two of them.
Compensates.
Yeah, maybe. It's pretty hard, because if you want to have a great career, it's hard to do that if you're alone and without a family, right? I mean, the people that I've seen who've been best situated in their life, all things considered, even in relationship to their career, have a pretty solid monogamous relationship that stabilizes them. And then they have a family that also stabilizes them and broadens out their life. And, you know, exceptional people do exceptional things, and good for them, but they're, by definition, given that they're exceptional, they're a tiny minority. This is always the argument between conservatives and liberals, right? Because the liberal types, they're more tilted sometimes towards, what would you call it, compassion or appreciation for the exceptional. And fair enough, the exceptional is necessary, but on average, what everyone does on average is the thing to do. And so you just look, you see, well, what do people do? Well, they have a job or a career, they have an intimate relationship, and they have a family. And if you don't have any one of those things, well, then you're treading water harder. Doesn't mean you can't do it. And it doesn't even mean possibly that you shouldn't try, but as a default presumption, it's just utterly foolish. What else are you going to do with your life? Well, maybe you're wildly creative. Fair enough, you know. That's extraordinarily rare as well, subject to the power law problem in any case, which is even if you're hyper creative, the probability that you're going to be successful at that economically is extremely, extremely tiny, to the point where it's almost non-existent. It's so difficult. Now, it does happen, and you can have spectacular success if you become successful. But power law, that's, you know, a tiny minority of people do all the work, a tiny minority of people get all the benefit. A tiny minority of athletes score all the goals. A tiny minority of men get all the women, etc. A tiny minority of stars have all the mass. A tiny minority of rivers have all the water. A tiny minority of cities have all the people, etc., etc., etc. Everywhere, always. You know, and we're so clueless in our culture that we blame that on capitalism. It's like, how does that account for the mass of stars, people? So, or the, you know, the volume of rivers, or the population density of cities, or it. So then you might ask yourself, well, what's the best antidote to the discomfort of life? And you might say, well, it's comfort. And I suppose that's what you act out when you swaddle a baby. But a better antidote is something like adventure to excellence. And that's far better antidote to suffering than the mere absence of suffering. So, not to say that the mere absence of suffering, that's not nothing, you know.